Good evening or hello. Thanks for joining us, both those in attendance tonight and those watching on our YouTube channel. Um, we're going to be talking in this video to Rupert Hague-Holmes, following the release of his book recently, The Soldiers General, Lieutenant General Sir George Lea. Firstly, a quick intro to Barnthorne. We're an independent publisher. We've been going nearly 2 years. It's knocking on for mainly military history titles, authors that range from first-time authors to those who have written multiple books before. So if you have any ideas for a book, whether it's military history or otherwise, please don't hesitate to get in touch for our website, etc. But now I'm going to hand over to Rupert. Rupert, would you like to introduce yourself? Just tell us a bit about your background.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I suppose the best way to describe myself is military history is my passion. So I was born and brought up in a military family, an army family. I was born in Berlin and, in a sense, lived with the army for very much my formative years. And in a sense, I suppose that's what kindled the interest that I've got in military history. I qualified as a lawyer in 1990. I practiced in London for nearly 10 years, then moved up to the Midlands. And then in 2004, I moved offshore to work in financial services in Guernsey. And then in 2012, I moved to my current location in Jersey, where I worked for nearly 10 years at Royal Bank of Canada, running their compliance function across the two islands, Jersey, Guernsey, and part of the business in London. And then in 2023, I semi-retired, so I still do some consultancy work, but wanted to focus on writing and finishing a book that you hopefully have had a chance to look at, Soldiers General, which I started some 4 years earlier.
So, I mean, that probably is a good point. I mean, how did your writing journey begin? Where, what was the nucleus of the idea, etc.?
The genesis of this book really came from a talk that I gave in 2019, a fundraising talk for the Army Benevolent Fund in Jersey, who asked me to do a talk about Jerseymen who had fought at the Battle of Arnhem in 1944. And so I managed to through research, I managed to get together a list of about 6 soldiers who had fought at Arnhem. But obviously, the standout person was George Lea, who at the time of Arnhem was commanding the 11th Parachute Battalion, but then went on to really have quite an illustrious military career after the war, rising to the rank of a lieutenant general with a knighthood. So he kind of stood out really amongst all the people who'd fought at Arnhem. He wasn't a Jerseyman as such in the way that people would describe Jerseymen here in Jersey. He wasn't born in Jersey, but he retired to Jersey in 1975 after he'd left the army and died here, not far away from where I'm sitting now, actually, about a mile away. So we made him an honorary Jerseyman just for the purpose of the talk. But that was the genesis of the book. Arnhem, and we'll come on to that, I'm sure, Ashley. But Arnhem was a professional embarrassment for him. But clearly, he went on to do great things post Arnhem, which led to him achieving such a high rank and getting a knighthood.
And I guess before that talk, I mean, were you aware of him and his career? How had he come to your knowledge for that talk, I suppose?
No, I wasn't. Is the honest answer, and I wasn't aware. I was obviously aware that I was aware of the names of the battalion commanders at Arnhem. Like many, hopefully, of listeners tonight, very interested in the Battle of Arnhem, and because I suppose we English always glorify failure, don't we? So I was aware of who he was in the sense that he was one of the battalion commanders, but I didn't know about the connection with Jersey. And I certainly didn't know that he'd gone on to command the SAS in the Malayan jungle and gone on to be director of operations in Borneo.
Hmm.
So I was aware vaguely of who he was, and actually his role, we'll come on to this, I'm sure, his role at Arnhem was pretty limited in the sense that he didn't really achieve very much, hence the professional embarrassment.
Yeah, no, understand. So I guess to introduce Lee to us, I mean, what's his early life look like, kind of leading up to joining the army?
So he was born in Kidderminster in Worcestershire into what I describe in the book as the carpet baron industry. So his parents were involved, his father and his lineage were all involved in the carpet manufacturing industry in Kidderminster. And they were pretty, I would say they were probably middle class, his parents, very devout religiously, although George himself wasn't very religious. And he grew up in Kidderminster. He went to school. I went to prep school in a place called Wellington, just outside Shrewsbury, and then went on to Charterhouse, where he didn't really excel academically. And this is an interesting thing I think about leaders. They don't necessarily need to be academic people to be good leaders. And George definitely wasn't an academic. But
Mm.
what he was very good at, he was a keen boxer. And he got at a pretty young age of 16, he got into the school boxing team. And I suppose, in a sense, that was his formative experience. He left Charterhouse at 16 and went to a crammer to prepare. He actually wants to join the Royal Air Force, but unfortunately didn't do particularly well in the Royal Air Force entrance examinations into Cranwell. So his uncle, who was a colonel in the Worcestershire Regiment, managed to pull some strings through old Charterhouse connections and managed to get him a place at the Royal Military College in Sandhurst in 1932. So he went off to Sandhurst. And again, he wasn't academic at all, certainly wasn't Sword of Honour material, and came out 109 out of 219 in his intake. But certainly was a leader, and I think his qualities as a leader were picked up pretty early in Sandhurst. He was made a junior under officer quite quickly at Sandhurst, often an indication that someone is being seen by the instructors as someone who's got a potential to go on well in the army. He originally tried to get into the Worcestershire Regiment, obviously from Kidderminster, and his uncle was in the Worcestershire Regiment in the First World War. But unfortunately, because he passed out relatively low in the intake, there were only 2 slots available for the Worcestershire Regiment, and they went to 2 officers who were higher up in the rankings.
Mm.
So he ended up plumbing for a regiment, the Lancashire Fusiliers, which in a way suited him because it had a great reputation as a boxing regiment and a sporting regiment. And he settled in there really well. He was commissioned in 1933. He joined them up in Catterick. Hunting was a big thing for George. He liked horses and he liked riding. So he immersed himself really in subaltern life in the Lancashire Fusiliers, moving down to Colchester in about 1933, getting himself a private pilot's license. He loved flying as well, and really quite enjoying. But it was an interesting time for the British Army. There'd been a lot of contraction after the First World War, and it was an interesting time for a young man to join the British Army as their career.
Yeah, and I guess at that point you've kind of left him, early 30s. Obviously, those who know their history knows what's kind of starting to happen. Obviously, we're creeping towards the events of the late 30s. So I guess at the start of the Second World War, where is he, and how has he found his way there?
So George is in India at the beginning of the Second World War, and he's found his way there because his battalion. So the way it used to work is, in those days, each of the county infantry regiments had 2 battalions. One would be overseas, and the other would be home based, and they'd swap over.
Mm.
So George was with the 1st Battalion and gets sent out to China originally. To protect the English settlements that have been established for trade reasons out in China. And of course, as the Second World War starts, the Japanese have invaded Manchuria in China, and George has some brushes with Japanese soldiers who are not at war with England or Britain at that time, and writes home talking about how aggressive they are and how they're making life difficult for the British settlement in China. And then the regiment gets moved to India. So at the beginning, as war breaks out in September 1939, George finds himself in India, which there were a lot of, there was a big military presence out in India at that time, 26 British battalions out there. And actually, George gets pretty frustrated pretty quickly because younger brother Christopher is also joined by this stage, the Lancashire Fusiliers. And his battalion, the 2nd Battalion, are part of the British Expeditionary Force who go over to France. And of course, as we get into 1940, they start engaging with the Germans as the Germans invade the Low Countries. Christopher gets wounded and manages to get evacuated from Dunkirk. And George is watching all of this from India, where there really isn't very much going on at all. There's lots of riding and there's lots of point-to-pointing and there's lots of equestrian stuff, but there really isn't a lot of soldiering going on.
Mm.
And he begins to get very frustrated.
Yeah, and remind me, was it in India or in China that his love life found a new interest?
Well, that was in India, in Quetta. So after they get moved from China to India, George, and I don't think he was necessarily into amateur dramatics at all, but I think there was a reason why he joined the Amateur Dramatic Society in Quetta, which was there was a very pretty 19-year-old lady called Pamela Lovett Taylor, who George was rather taken. In fact, he fell in love with her at first sight. And they play leading roles in an amateur dramatic play in Quetta, in the Quetta Amateur Dramatic Society. And George, really rather taken by Pamela, very pretty, vivacious 19-year-old, and asked for her hand in marriage quite shortly after they start courting. And she declines because she's having far too good a time being taken out by loads of British officers in Quetta. So George, both frustrated from a military perspective and frustrated from a love perspective, decides he's going to do something quite adventurous with his life and decides to join a newly formed parachute battalion in Delhi called 151 Parachute Battalion.
Mm.
And he's immediately made the adjutant, so he's a captain at this time, with his main task to go around recruiting soldiers and officers for this newly formed battalion. So that's what he did for the most part of 1941. He's teamed up with Colonel Martin Lindsay, who was a very interesting character, who was the first CO of this battalion. And they go around all the British Army units in India, signing up volunteers to join this parachute battalion.
Yeah, and so I guess in one way, he had got on the bus very early in terms of this parachuting. It was unlike now. It was at the it was a new thing. It's compared to the end of the Second World War, where obviously our parachute, but battalions, brigades structure was a lot bigger. At this point, it was very fledgling. So how does that then lead up then from joining this kind of fledgling unit? Talk us through to kind of like the eve of Arnhem, as it were.
So, as you rightly say, it was very fledgling. So they only had 40 parachutes, and there was about 700 men in this battalion. So it took them a long time, and also the availability of aircraft. The Royal Air Force was not very supportive of parachuting generally, and that was both in the UK and in India. So it took them a long time to work the battalion up to operational effectiveness. But finally, in late 1943, the battalion gets warned to move to the Middle East. And of course, they had problems with morale in the lead up to that because soldiers were saying, well, hang on, we joined up to fight and we're not even parachuting and we're not even fighting. So they had problems with soldiers wanting to leave to go back to their original units who were fighting against the Japanese who were coming across Burma. But anyway, the battalion gets moved to the Middle East, to Gabrit, and gets formed up with part of other battalions who are formed up to form the 4th Parachute Brigade. And again, there's a lot of morale issues over the 12 months leading up to the eve of Arnhem because they're not put into battle. The 1st Parachute Brigade had been formed by that stage and were already fighting in Tunisia. But George and his colleagues in the 4th Parachute Brigade really didn't have that much to do other than exercises and training and brushes with the SAS, who were the officers' mess. They actually shared the officers' mess in Cabrit with people like Sterling and Maine and other people. So, but I suppose things looked up in late November 1943 when they were tasked to go by, not to parachute. The first Parachute Brigade had already dropped into Sicily, but George and his colleagues in the 4th Parachute Brigade, this stage the battalion was now known as 156 Parachute Battalion, they take part in Operation Slapstick, which is the invasion by sea, so they get transported by boat to Taranto And they finally see a bit of action in Italy when they're fighting German Fallschirmjäger, crack German troops in Sicily, in the toe of Italy. Sorry, not Sicily, Italy. And George finally gets a bit of taste of action when he's made 2IC of 156 Parachute Battalion. However, that action is pretty short-lived. They get withdrawn and eventually get moved back to the UK. George gets taken out of 156 Parachute Battalion. He's made Brigade Major of 4th Parachute Brigade by Brigadier John Hackett, Shan Hackett. And he takes part in a lot of the exercises in the UK as preparations are made for D-Day. And is it going to be the 6th Airborne Division that get used on D-Day? Is it going to be the 1st Airborne Division? No one really quite knows. There's a lot of exercises that take place in the UK. And then, in a stroke of luck, really, or luck or opportunity, the 11th Parachute Battalion was the youngest battalion in the 4th Parachute Brigade. They'd had a lot of discipline problems. And Shan Hackett removed Colonel Mickey Thomas, who was the CO of that battalion, didn't feel he was firm enough to pull together the disparate elements of a newly formed battalion, and put George Lea in as the CO. So this is in July 1944, and George literally has 2 months to pull a battalion together, ready for an operational drop. And then we go through the 16 cancelled operations over August and September, and the frustrations around that. And then finally, George and his 11th Parachute Battalion drop into Arnhem on the second day, on Monday, the 18th of September.
And I guess a few things there. So, I mean, firstly, interesting to note that having, done lots of training, eventually the first time seeing action, and they didn't drop out of the sky as they perhaps thought they would. So, and ironically against Fallschirmjäger, who wouldn't have dropped out of the sky either, I imagine. They were obviously both fighting as effectively light infantry, uh,
Yeah,
in a bit of a different role to maybe they had envisaged. But I guess the skills that he must have picked up from managing these, frustrated, guys who chomping at the bit, wanting to get out there and do something and join the war, as it were. When he then arrived at 11 Para, faced with perhaps a similar situation, obviously morale was questionable, all of these cancelled operations, the constant, highs and lows of we're going, we're not going. Do you think that that had kind of put him in good stead, I suppose, that earlier experience for the latter one?
I think it did. And actually, his experience in 2 months between July 1944 and September 1944, trying to pull together a very disparate battalion that had been formed in the Middle East from lots of different types of troops, I think that put him in really good stead when he was made CO of 22 SAS in Malaya, which we'll come to, that whole experience. But, George he was not a martinet, but he was definitely a disciplinarian. So he wasn't. He pulled the battalion together by forced marches, creating esprit de corps. So one of the first things he did was get special T-shirts made for the boxing team with 11 parachute battalion, 11 in the Roman numerals. So he did things that created a degree of esprit de corps, which was really missing in that battalion. To the extent that when he took the battalion into Arnhem, I think it was in much better shape and in a much better position to fight, but unfortunately didn't get the opportunity to do so.
So I guess without making this a talk about Arnhem, what was the intended role for 11 Para, and versus what actually happens? What does Lee find himself dealing with once his boots on the ground?
Well, it's the classic, the first thing that happens when you get into contact with the enemy is the plan goes wrong. So the plan went wrong. So George and his battalion, all 571 of them, drop on the second day. The Germans are waiting for them. The King's Own Scottish Borderers and the Borders have been trying to defend the drop zones and had a hell of a fight on their hands trying to keep the Germans away from the drop zones, but weren't 100% successful. So George and his troops drop onto a hot zone, as it's known colloquially by paratroopers. They were jumping into contact. George actually dislocates his shoulder on landing. So he's running across the drop zone, trying to put his shoulder in, gathering up soldiers, as he makes his way down to the southeastern corner of Drop Zone Y, to where his battalion RV is. And as he gets there, the Chief of Staff of the division, Charles Mackenzie, arrives and tells them that actually the general's gone missing, Urquhart's gone missing, Brigadier Pip Hicks is in command, and he's decided that the 11th Battalion, George's battalion, is not going to pursue their original objective, which was to take the high ground north of Arnhem to protect the people at the bridge, but instead was to go immediately into town and help the other battalions trying to fight through to Colonel Johnny Frost and the 2nd Parachute Battalion. So, and George didn't question this at all. And again, I think that's a symptomatic of he didn't question it at all, even though his brigade commander, John Hackett, didn't know anything about this. And he found out later. So he does exactly as he's asked. He takes his battalion into the town. They arrive there late that night, and they have an orders group with the other battalion commanders in Arnhem, and the next day try and fight their way through to the bridge. I'm cutting a very long story short. After counter order, chaotic decision making, through no fault of anyone's really, Urquhart had managed to get back to his divisional headquarters that morning and changed the orders. So Lee was required to go north of the railway line. And as his battalion were forming up to follow through that order, they get caught by self-propelled guns and mortars and lots of German infantry. And the battalion just gets dissipated, scattered. And the whole command structure is lost, platoons mixed up, companies mixed up. And within about 18 hours of dropping, George and his headquarters platoon, defence platoon, are all captured in a house in the Western Arnhem. And it was all over.
Mm. As you say, it's such an incredible story, and his part in it. Obviously, you can understand why it was a bit of a chip on his shoulder, perhaps like in later years.
Yeah, it was a massive professional embarrassment for him. He was a man of integrity, and he felt very, very responsible for the fact he'd taken 571 people into Arnhem with him.
Mm.
Of that, only about 70 got back over the river about 10 days later. About 90 were killed. And the rest, so you can work out the numbers, about 400 of them were all captured. Hugely embarrassing for him. And even though he would have taken off his rank insignia, as all the officers were told to do on capture, he was obviously segregated out, and he was realised he was quite a senior commander and interrogated. So, but he carried that cross, if that's the right word, for the rest of his professional career, to the extent, and you heard me mention this at the launch, and that Arnhem just wasn't discussed in the Lee household.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I can understand why, and I think, I guess with that, let's turn the attention to post Second World War, because that's very clearly, to anyone reading the book, that's when it all starts to blossom and come together for him in his professional career. So what happens first? Where does he go after
So
Second World War?
So he's obviously in Offlag 79 in Brunswick for 8-9 months. He gets liberated by the Americans. He gets home. He then gets immediately sent out to the Far East, where the war with Japan is still going on. There's talk about dropping paratroopers into Singapore to relieve. That never happens because of the atomic bombs. And so he comes back from the Far East and is given command of a territorial parachute battalion up in Yorkshire. And again, I think you can see some threads here where a very disparate battalion being made up from ground, from scratch, really, and that really tested, I think, Lee's abilities to inspire people, to get people who'd had enough of war by that stage, to get them back into part-time soldiering. He was very lucky. He had a troop of ex-SAS regulars led by a chap called Johnny Cooper, who was one of the originals. They joined him up in Bradford. And so he did that. And then he was, and again, I suppose this is where the things started turning. He was selected to be one of the first British officers to attend the NATO Defence College in Fontainebleau. And these were, so he was a lieutenant colonel at this stage. And these were officers who've been selected as people who were going to go on within the hierarchy. But more importantly, were probably going to play a part in the NATO infrastructure, which was then just being assembled by Eisenhower. So he spends about a year at NATO Defence College making a huge amount of contacts within the American, French, and all the other NATO partners' military structure, and then gets sent on the uh, Services Staff College in Latimer, which again indication. So the criteria for that was that you had to be an officer who was going to go on for at least two ranks above. So he must have known at that stage he was probably going to become a brigadier. So he
Mm.
does that course, and then he spends a bit of time at Shape, which was then in Paris, Supreme Headquarters à la Power Europe, in a job that he absolutely hated. And the reason based in Paris, he loved France, a real Francophile, but he hated the job because this was at the time when the French were being incredibly difficult about NATO, and being really awkward about lots of things. And he found the drudgery of the staff work, having to get the French to agree to everything. He found that very difficult.
Mm.
He was then offered the opportunity to command a battalion of his regiment, his old regiment, the Lancashire Fusiliers, which was then in Trieste in Yugoslavia, just off the edge of Italy, trying to stop Marshal Tito from taking over Italy. But that all fell through because, in line with the cuts that were taking place in the mid 1950s, the second battalions of all the county regiments got disbanded. So he didn't get the opportunity to command it. And actually, he was thinking about leaving the army. And it
Mm.
was Pammy, who was by now found her after the war and married her. It was Pammy who convinced him to stay in the army. And then left field, he gets a call just before Christmas in December 1954, telling him he's going to be given command of a very specialist unit. He couldn't be told what it was because it had to be approved by the Army Board, but it would involve parachuting, which came as a bit of a surprise for him. Bear in mind, I think his words were he'd spent 3 years on French cuisine. And he hadn't parachuted for 11 years. The thought of having to do that again really didn't feel. But of course, what this was, he was being given a mandate to make or break the fledgling SAS in the Malayan jungle. And they'd been reformed after the war under Mike Calvert. And when he arrived at 22 SAS in Malaya in February 1955, it was really a unit with quite a mixed reputation. They were reasonably effective operationally, but there were issues with out of jungle discipline. And Lee was just the right man to go in with a steely hand, but a humane way of dealing with discipline. As I said before, he wasn't a martinet. He brought in an RSM who was a complete martinet. And between the two of them, they really shook it up. And they weeded out quite a few unsuitable people, officers and men. And they brought in people like Peter de la Billiere, who went on to become a four-star general and director, CO of 22, director of Special Forces, and put in the operational infrastructure that really brought the SAS, I think, within the British Army order of battle. The SAS were going to be disbanded at the end of the Malayan Emergency, but George Lea played a very important part, along with a team, John Woodhouse, John Slim, other names that people who know much about the SAS will have heard of. He put the operational infrastructure in there. He put the discipline in there, operational discipline and off-duty discipline, to the extent that he convinced the British hierarchy that the SAS had a role to play beyond Malaya. And that's one of the reasons why the foreword to the book was written by a chap I was at university with, General Sir Mark Carleton-Smith, who himself was a CO of 22 and Director of Special Forces. It's a very glowing, I think, foreword. And actually, Sir Mark is Colonel Commandant of the SAS. I think it's probably a thank you on behalf of the SAS for keeping them in the game. So, that was achievement number one, I think, post-war. He came left field, surprise choice, but right man, right moment. And a lot of people in the SAS, I think, have got George Lea to thank for keeping them, having the opportunity of doing special forces work.
Yeah, and I guess what's interesting is, I mean, obviously from today's view, where we're used to, an army that's at its smallest since pre-Waterloo or whenever it was, you know, to fathom how George Lee is one officer in a sea of so many in a much larger organization, certainly obviously during the Second World War, how, even at Sandhurst, despite being quite midfield, they picked out qualities in him. Despite what happened at Arnhem, which, if you're going on form, although albeit maybe not directly his fault, by association, it may not have been a good performance, but they saw the quality there. And it again interesting that his career, had that second battalion not been disbanded or it happened at a later date, etc. His career and indeed the future of the SAS at that point could have been a very different story.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of lessons about leadership in the book.
Mm.
And also, I think about life. How one door closes, another opens. Always grasp an opportunity. You never know where it's going to take you, and that was definitely an opportunity for him. But I
Mm.
think he had been marked out as someone who had a reputation for a very nice manner, very charming manner, but was steely.
Mm.
And wouldn't take truck, wouldn't put up with any nonsense at all. There was absolutely no doubt who was the boss, but also he led in a way which was humane. So one of the lovely things said about George Lea in one of his obituaries in the Daily Telegraph is, and I think this is such a lovely epitaph for anyone actually, is it said George Lea could sack you but still remain your friend. Isn't that an incredible, so that smacks of someone who can take tough decisions about people, probably people he liked, but could still deliver in a humane and empathetic way. And I think people warm to that. They
Mm.
warm to the fact that they knew he was the boss, he would decide, he would execute, he would take responsibility, but he had their back and he looked after them. And some of the quotes, some of the letters of condolences that came in when he's died. There's another one from John Woodhouse. It talked about the fact that soldiers were complaining that George Lea used to go out on patrol with them so much because he wasn't a desk-bound CO. He wanted to experience the privations that his soldiers were. If he was going to lead them, he had to understand what they were dealing with. And one of the lovely quotes in the letter of condolences was the troopers were complaining that George kept going out on patrol with them and that he was getting tired. And actually, what he should be doing was looking after them. But it said so much, didn't it? So there's lots of lessons around leadership, I think.
Mm.
Humility, integrity, um, a sense of fun as well. George, he had a good sense of humour, and some of the anecdotes in the book
Yeah.
around his time in the SS are thoroughly amusing,
I think
particularly the
that
ones.
I
Sorry.
think the one, obviously this is a bit later in his story, but the one where he meets the is it the mayor or the councillor?
Yeah, so this is when he was a major general. He was commanding a territorial division based out of Preston in Lancashire. One of the first things he arrived, this story relayed by his former ADC, Major John Steeds. One of the first things when he arrived is an important part of that role was to work closely with the civic authorities. So he told John Steeds, right, I want to go around and meet all the mayors in the area. Can you organise that, please? And Lee described it as mayor baiting. That was his expression for going to visit all the local municipal leaders. And so Steeds organises all of this and recounted a particular occasion when they went to see the Lord Mayor in the city of Manchester, who was a lady mayoress. And they arrive in the staff car. Lee's kitted out in his blues. Very tall man. He was 6'6",
Hmm.
so very big man, very impressive, dignified posture he had. He gets out of the car. John Steeds' ADC is running behind him, and he bounds up the stairs. And just as he gets to the top of the stairs and is about to salute this lady mayoress, who was a rather short, rotund lady, she flings her arms open and says, come into my parlour, love." And of course, and for Lee, she squeezed him so hard his hat fell off, apparently. And Lee thought this was hysterical. And as he follows her into the Lord Mayor's hall, out of the corner of his mouth, he says to John Steeds, "Make sure you deal with the warm sherry I'm about to be given." So he had a tremendous sense of fun, which again I think is very, very important in a leadership context, knowing when to be light-hearted about things, and creating an environment where people do feel able to express themselves in a
Hmm.
fun way in the right circumstances. Yeah, but there was no doubt who the boss was, and he
Yeah,
was quite happy to crack the whip and get rid of people if he needed to.
definitely. This might have been in Borneo, but he was quite loved by the Kiwis. He had quite a good partnership with them.
So this was actually in Malaya when he was
Sorry, Malaya.
CEO of Sutu. Although he did reacquaint himself with the New Zealanders in Borneo. As part of the New Zealand commitment to the Malayan Emergency, they formed a new squadron, and they were put under George Lee's command. So he actually had 5 squadrons under his command when he was CO of 22. And he got on incredibly well with the Kiwis, to the extent I was actually out in New Zealand last year, and he's still remembered down there and revered down there by some of the originals. There's 10 of them still alive from those mid 1950s, and they loved him because he was a no nonsense, straight talking, and that kind of resonated with the Kiwis. They liked that. That was a style that, and he kept up friendships with loads of them. Right the way beyond, leaving the army. Actually, he was invited back to the 50th anniversary of the New Zealand SAS in Auckland. He couldn't go because he was quite elderly by that stage and wasn't very well. But it was a measure of the fact that he kept in touch with lots of them. And yeah, his style, his leadership style, no nonsense, do what the men do. That really resonated with the Kiwis, particularly the tough Maoris, who really warmed to his style of leadership.
Definitely. So far we've seen him out in China. He's been in India. He's been in the Middle East, back home, Arnhem, Malaya. So where else are we going on his journey now?
So straight from Malaya, he goes from lieutenant colonel to brigadier. He skips out full colonel. That's always a sign of someone who's progressing well. He's given a brigade command based out of Plymouth. They're part of strategic reserve. Bit of a frustrating time for him, really. He was a man who liked to soldier. And they kept getting called into exercises. And the strategic reserve, at one point they're going to go to Cyprus, but they don't go. And then he goes, and then he gets a very interesting job as deputy military secretary in the War Office in London. And that's a key job because in the military secretary's office, they decide who's going to do what above the rank of major in the British Army. Who's going to do what? So it was a great experience for him and be able to see how the army selection process worked. And it also helped him in the sense that there were people in the SAS who were similar to George, weren't particularly academic, but were good soldiers and good leaders. And he helped to through, well, John Woodhouse in particular, he helped get command of the SAS, despite the fact he hadn't been to staff college, which normally was a requirement. So the military secretary's obviously does that, and then he goes up to Lancashire to do the job I just talked about. And then again, a bit left field, he gets a warning order out of the blue to go to Central Africa to manage the dismantlement of the Central African Federation, which was Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia, which subsequently became, as they transitioned through to independence, this is the mid-1960s, they transitioned to independence, they become Malawi and Zambia. George is given the difficult task politically of segregating all the troops and handing them over to these individual sovereign states, and which he did with enormous tact and diplomacy. And I think that set him up for his subsequent job as Director of Operations in Borneo, which when I look at his career, I think Malaya 22 SAS and Borneo really were the two crowning successes of his career, because he arrived in Borneo as Director of Operations. He took over from Walter Walker, who many people will know from the Borneo operation, in early 1966. And the war was the conflict with the Indonesians was at a very delicate stage. The British government had already authorized operations called Claret, highly secretive. British government didn't want to admit it, but they had authorized it, where British troops were going over the border of Borneo into Indonesia, killing Indonesian soldiers before they could even infiltrate into Borneo. And that was really delicate because it was so secretive that when the British, mainly the SAS and the Gurkhas, although subsequently some of the infantry battalions did, but mainly the SAS and the Gurkhas, when they went over the border, if they took casualties at all, they had to bring them back over the border. So, and to the level of detail to try and make sure that they couldn't be traced as being in Indonesia included picking up spent cartridges, putting them in their belt kit, and bringing it back. One unusual, or one fact that's not necessarily terribly well known, that there was a Gurkha who won a VC in Borneo in late 1966. He was involved in a Claret operation that went over the border into Indonesia, where he actually won his VC in Indonesia. But the British government changed the citation to make it look as though he won it in Borneo. That's how sensitive it was. And so to try and explain that for you, They were so sensitive, those incursions over into Indonesia, that George Lee had to authorize every single operation because he was carrying the political risk that it would become known that British soldiers were in Indonesia. So he was carrying the British government's reputation every time he ordered every single operation. And that took huge delicacy, tact, diplomacy, shrewdness. And what ended up happening, by the middle of '66, when Lee got there, the Indonesians, I think, realized they were beginning to lose, or certainly weren't going to win the conflict. And they were starting to negotiate. And in fact, a revolt happened in Indonesia, which helped bring the conflict to an end. So the Indonesian army were actually negotiating directly with the Malaysians to end the conflict. And what George was doing, it was almost, and this is described in one of the books quite succinctly, every time the Indonesians started getting difficult at the negotiating table, he would authorize a Claret operation and send British troops over into Indonesia to help focus their minds. And it's described in one of the books as unleashing the dogs of war. And I've just got this vision of George Lee sitting there saying, right, these guys are being difficult at the negotiating table. We're going to send some boys across the border and cause a bit of trouble and make them think a bit more seriously about peace. So a really good example of how military force is used for political ends. But I think an incredibly difficult job, I think, because it requires so much diplomacy and so much tact and so much guile. One of the other things he did in Borneo that was so successful is he managed to pull, going back to his joint services staff college days, managed to pull he had the Royal Navy under his command and the Royal Air Force, managed to pull them together and make them work, and also with the police and the civilian authorities as well. So Lee got a knighthood on the back of his work. He brought Borneo to an end militarily. And he got a knighthood for that, which was very, very unusual for a major general, as he was then, to get a knighthood. And then he got sent on to, he must have thought that he was going to go to the top of the army at that point. He had a big backer, General Sir Richard Hull, Field Marshal Sir Richard Hull, who was Chief of the General Staff and became Chief of the Defence Staff, actually. And Hull was a big supporter of Lee. And he got sent out in 1967. Coming towards the end of his career, he got sent to Washington to head up the British defence staff there. And he was ideal for that. The Americans were putting a lot of pressure on the Brits to support the Vietnam War, which they'd got enmeshed in the 60s militarily. Harold Wilson, Prime Minister, and the British government did not want to put British troops in there for financial reasons. Britain was on its knees financially in the late 60s, and they could not afford to get involved in another counterinsurgency. So George was sent out there really as a counterinsurgency specialist to help the Americans subtly manage the Vietnam War. And so if you read the book, the chapter on Washington is very much George going around the States to the United States Army Staff College, the United States Air Force College, lecturing or talking to the American military about the successes of Malaya and how hearts and minds, winning the villagers over to stop them supplying food to the terrorists, and how you need a political solution. This is Borneo, political solution alongside your military, and you run the two together. He did a lot of work trying to educate the Americans. Whether they listened or not, I don't know. The Vietnam War went on for a lot longer, but he played a very important role. And sadly, that was the end of his career. He didn't go on further. In the book, it's very difficult to try and get to the bottom of why that happened. You'd think to yourself, well, here's a guy who was so successful post-war. Why did he not become Chief of the General Staff? Well, I think the British Army is a very tribal environment, probably still is, I don't know. George, and you made this point earlier, Ashley, George was a Far Eastern counterinsurgency specialist. He'd never served in the British Army of the Rhine. And we're talking about 1970 now, where the big threat to Britain was perceived to be not in the Far East, where they were pulling back from the Far East, was perceived to be the massed ranks of Soviet armor coming across the northwest German plain. And poor old George, he didn't have any experience of any command in British Army of the Rhine. And I think that's probably what his undoing was. He didn't have the right experience, operational experience, much as his operational experience was brilliant, it was all counterinsurgency in the Far East. So I think, and so he decided to leave the army. He worked in London for about 5 years, which he thoroughly hated in the city. It wasn't him at all. His daughter, Annabel, recounts a story about him very reluctantly getting on the tube every day and taking the tube in from his house in Fulham into the city, really not enjoying it at all. And so he decided to retire to Jersey, where his father-in-law bought a house after the war, and had a I think a very pleasant 15 years before he died in 1990, doing a lot of community type things. So he was president of the Jersey Scout Association. So I often think about how many scouts in the 70s will remember this big, big man who, had all this jungle experience, showing them how to build fires and this kind of stuff. I'm sure there's loads of Jersey people who probably remember him in that sense. He was chairman of the Royal British Legion, and true to his leadership style, he wasn't just a figurehead. He was counting the money with the ladies in the room as they collected the money in from the doors. And he also, and there's a lovely story about his humility, I think, as a person. His wife, Pammy, bought an interior design business in St Helier, which they ran. And George Lea was asked to become a member of what's called the Victoria Club, which here in Jersey is quite a nice, well, it no longer exists, but it was a nice, very white-collar old boys sort of lunch club. And it was suggested soon after he arrived in Jersey that he should join. So he got the application form, and when it asked for his name, he put George Lea, put his address down. And when it asked for his occupation, at this time, Pamela was running the interior design shop. So he put shopkeeper. He didn't put his rank, he didn't put his knighthood, he didn't put his post-nominals, he didn't put anything. And apparently the story goes that when this came before the membership committee, the chairman said, I'm not having a shopkeeper in my club. But very fortunately, probably for George and probably for the Victoria Club, there was a retired army officer who obviously recognised who he was, and the membership got reinstated. But it's a great example, I think, of what he was like as a person. He didn't stand on ceremony at all. He didn't need to put that he was a general or, he was applying for a membership of an old boys club. He didn't feel it necessary. So again, another piece of leadership and lesson in there around humility and just conducting yourself in the right way.
Definitely. And obviously, a few times through this, you've talked about the family, and you've gone on such a journey with them with this book. Would you like to talk a bit about that, of the support you've been given, etc.?
Well, I'm actually incredibly lucky, actually, because I don't think this book would ever have happened without George's mother, who was a lady well before her time. I'll come back to her in a little second, but she kept copious records for George. So in fact, there were four very big family albums. When I first got into contact with George's children, Annabel and Tim, I was given access to four very big family albums of photographs, letters, all manner of different things, which really made it easy for me to actually understand the man, because when you read his letters, you get a feel for the person, understand the man, and also provide a lot of detail around his career. So I was very lucky with that. But his mother, if I can, I actually dedicated the book to her because I could never have written it without her. But she was a lady well before her time. So she was a poet, and there's some lovely poems she wrote about George, which are really prescient. One of them, which talks about him as a statesman or as a general or as a politician. So she was pretty good at looking forward. But she was very much ahead of her time, because in 1917 she wrote to the editor of The Spectator complaining that one of the book reviews in The Spectator on a crime novel had revealed the whodunit. So the reviewer had told the readers who'd done the crime, and she was very upset about this. But to give the context to that, in 1917, ladies did not write to editors. It just didn't. It's unthinkable now, but in those days, it just didn't happen. So she was an incredible person, really, and the reason I acquired so much respect for her and the way she choreographed his career, that I had to dedicate the book to her. But the family, Annabel and Tim, his two children, have been so supportive, so supportive. You couldn't ask for more, really. Very, very lucky.
Yeah, and there was a very, as you've alluded to earlier, we did we had a book launch at the Tower of London at the Lancashire Fusiliers Museum there, or Royal Fusiliers, and there was a really touching moment after you'd given your kind of speech, as it were, and she basically had welcomed you into the family as one of their own, and said that you probably knew George better than they did in many respects, but. I'm sure she was being humble like her father also. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think that's a good point to kind of come to a conclusion. The title of the book, The Soldier's General, I guess, what would be your summary conclusion on why that's appropriate to George Lee?
George knew how to talk to people at all different levels in life, whether they were kings, queens, or whether they were private soldiers. George knew how to talk to them. And that's why the title, The Soldier's General, in fact, I took it as a quote from Peter Dickens's book on the SAS operations in Borneo. Soldiers adored him. They respected him more than they adored him. They respected him because they knew he had their back. There's a lovely photograph in the book of him talking to some Royal Navy sailors in Borneo because he had the Royal Navy under his command in Borneo. And I think a picture always says a thousand words, doesn't it? You can see from the way he's talking. He's talking to three sailors. One of them's holding, I think it's a cat or a dog. I can't remember. Obviously, the ship's cat or the ship's dog. But you can see how relaxed the sailors are talking to him, and that I think just sums him up. He knew how to talk to people, not down to people. He knew how to engage. And I think, if you're going to define leadership in one word, you'd say it's influence. And I think George had that. He just had that ability. He was charming, steely, but had that ability to be able to engage with people at all different levels. So that's the reason for the title.
Yeah, I think it's very apt, and I love that photograph as well. There's many good photographs of George in the book, and very worth seeing. But I think having obviously read the manuscript several times over, I think without those photos, I don't think you'd have necessarily had that visual proof in your your mind's eye type thing, and seeing that, and you going, okay, yeah, this is the same guy. It very much is the Soldier's General. So the Soldier's General is available to purchase on our website only at the moment. So please have a look at barnformpublishing.co.uk. Rupert, now that you've got the writing bug, obviously after your first 4 years stint, what's next?
Well, I've been asked by the other part of the Lee family to write about George's younger brother, Christopher, who was also commissioned into the Lancashire Fusiliers, and was about 5 years behind George. But most interestingly about him, he took part in the first airborne operation of the Second World War. Whilst George was in India, and this was part of his frustration, he was hearing about Christopher's exploits in Europe. Christopher dropped as part of Operation Colossus in February 1941, which was a complete disaster as a military operation, but did two important things. One, it raised morale at a
Mm.
difficult time for the UK, striking back. But secondly, there were some important lessons learned in parachuting. And then Christopher was in prison for 4 years, having been captured with everyone else on Colossus, read the Bible, studied law, became a lawyer after the war, became a judge, was a mental health specialist, actually. So, again, someone, in the 1970s, well ahead of their time. And then got his vocation. God came calling, and he became a curate, became a vicar. So if you think, the old Victorian family, three sons, one went in the army, one went in the church, one went in the law. Well, Christopher Lee did all three, the Holy Trinity, as he described it. So I've been asked by the other part of the family to write about Christopher. So that's what my next book's going to be about.
No, great stuff. Well, we look forward to reading that in due course. Hopefully not in 4 years' time, but obviously
I
when you're
promise
ready.
them it's going to be a lot quicker.
Good stuff. Right. Well, thank you very much, Rupert. I'm gonna stop the recording then. But yeah, this obviously is available on YouTube. Please look at our website as mentioned earlier. So thank you very much.